Hey, good morning, everybody. As you may recall, last week we left off with Mr. Potato Head here. Um, so I've taken a bunch of cubes essentially and mashed them together to make these separate parts here. That comprise my head. So I got eyelids, top and bottom, and nose, and there was and you're probably wondering why not just sculpt it as one mesh? And the reason I did this was that it's actually easier to get these kind of overlapping forms here that way, and also it made it easier for me to. So, for example, I'm working on just the shape of the overall head, and I decide that maybe the nose is too small, or maybe it's a little too high or too low, I can take that part there and very easily I can adjust the nose. If I wanted to, I could come in here and I don't know, I could just say, maybe I like the shape and everything, but I just feel like it should be a little bit bigger, like he should have a bigger nose than that. That's very easy to do, and I didn't have to worry about the rest of it. Very easy. Um, but once you get to the point where you're like, okay, enough of this, I'm happy with it. I want to look like one nice head. And that's where ZBrush is very powerful. It has what you could think of as some very sophisticated Boolean operations. Um, Actually, the first thing we're going to do is just combine these meshes. So in the subtool palette, there's a merge option. If you've got UVs, check on UV. Don't bother with weld here, and you just merge down. And now I have one subtool. I'm going to name it Mystery Guest Source, and we're going to just duplicate that real quick. Just save confusion there. And now your options for remeshing or under the subtool menu itself, they have this kind of old school remesh option, and this would, if you were to do this, it would create an envelope around the whole mesh, a new mesh, and then you could project that envelope down onto the original mesh if you wanted to. And that option is useful, but what we're going to look at today is called DynaMesh, and very similar but a little more sophisticated. So they both options, you have this resolution here, and you can think of this as a texture map. Perhaps you could think of it as like a displacement map. What's the resolution of the displacement map you're going to paint? And I typically I'll go around 1024, and that's a good middle ground. So I want my mesh to be not too dense, right? So it's easy to make big edits. It's easy to make big edits on a lighter mesh. So let's say, okay, I'm going to go with 1024, hit DynaMesh, and it's doing its business. It's kind of calculating the boundaries of all these separate subtools and creating an envelope and reprojecting it, and all in one go. Sometimes it takes a little bit for it to think about it. You just be patient. And there you go. So right now it looks identical. So it turns out that 1024 was a pretty good resolution. You can see, yeah, so that was probably denser than I really needed there. So actually I'm going to undo it, and we're going to go back to DynaMesh, and I'll try like 512 this time. So 1024 turned out to be too heavy there. Boom. So that's a little better, right? When you turn off wireframe, it looks pretty much the same, but you can see some polygons in there. It's not a dense mesh, not as dense. So anyway, so now we have this guy. I'm going to throw on a layer like this, and maybe our mesh is still reasonably symmetrical. So we've got symmetry on, and now all we have to do is go in here and start smoothing out the areas where I don't want it to look like it's a separate mesh. And it is no longer separate. This is one contiguous mesh now. So now it is very easy. You can see how easy it is to smooth out these edges where the two meshes penetrated. I keep doing that sometimes. So my document size is a bit small here. But yeah. Just go around. And in some places, like here, is where you want it to be super sharp, you know. So this is what you get from this approach, is, you know, these kinds of edges, which would have been maybe a lot more difficult to, sorry about that, sculpt by, you know, by trying to imagine when you're trying to carve in here, it's very hard to get a very crisp edge like that. But it's much easier to smooth these two surfaces here where I don't want it to be crisp. So now we've got very crisp edges where the lips meet and where the nose fold happens. And then we've got these nice subtle transitions. And I mean, you can see, I mean, that was in real time, right? It was pretty quick. So right now, like, it feels like pretty emaciated. So then you just come back and start sculpting on top of it. You know, oh, it's a bit rough there. Yeah. Now just looking at my reference, I feel like, yeah, that his orbits are a bit sunken there, so we're just gonna smooth that, turn my draw size, my intensity down a bit. And just keep plowing away here. And that's basically it. Now, of course, I'm going to keep working on this model for a while, but you can see how it's going to come together pretty quickly. So you have to be a little patient in the when things are separate. You know, there's that tendency, there's that temptation just to get on with it, finish it. But if you hang in there for a while, it pays off. Makes your life easier down the road, right? And this is where I ended up with this guy. He's still rough. It's a sketch, but maybe you can recognize who I'm trying to make here. It's rough. I try to do a lot of these guys, like just real quick ZBrush sketches, you know, like maybe, in all honesty, they're probably 4 hours, 8 max. But they're good practice and they're fun to do. But for the purposes of this demo, he'll work just fine, right? So he's a bit rough, but that's okay. Because actually I can show you some things, you know, i.e. how to clean him up in a pretty quickly. You know, make him, smooth him out and make him look halfway decent. And in particular, our ultimate goal is to make a mesh that we could, you know, actually animate. We could stick a skeleton in and animate. And to do that, we will retopo the topology, and I will go into that at a later date. However, in the meantime, something that's pretty exciting related to DynaMesh is Zremesh. Use Zremesh to basically when you've got a something that's just getting ridiculously expensive and maybe it's several million polygons, and you need to optimize it. Zremesh comes to the rescue, and coincidentally, I think it's a long way towards an automatic retopo tool. At the moment, we retopo and largely by hand, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is our DynaMesh. Pretty dense. I've made it dense enough to capture the detail, but I would not want to try and rig this. This is crazy. So that's where Zremesh comes in. And so under geometry, where you would find DynaMesh, a little bit further down below, you find Zremesh. And this will make, if you've got multiple subtools like we did with the DynaMesh, it's not going to turn them into one subtool. But once you have, so here we have our meshes, we have a contiguous mesh and we just want to optimize it. Zremesh is great for that. And you can, and this is where I'm, regarding retopo, this is where it gets interesting. So Zremesh comes with this brush called Zremesher Guides. And with these guides, you can control somewhat how it creates the loops. Let me turn on symmetry for a minute. So check this out. So we can draw where we want the loops to go. In this case, I'm circling the orbits because if this was to be, if we want to animate this face, you'd want the topo to follow, basically you want the topo to follow the contours of the muscles. Like, so if you strip off somebody's skin, I'm not suggesting you do that, but if you were to do that, you would discover that the muscles of the eyes and the mouth literally form loops around those orbits, hence the word orbit. And so we're going to try and coax Zremesher into following the contours of the actual facial muscles, which would make it easier to animate. It has a resolution, target poly count in thousands. It's pretty loosey-goosey, but let's roll with this 5,000 target poly count, and we just hit Zremesh, and it has to think about this. We're asking it to do a lot, so it has to think for a little bit. I should probably just edit this part out, but there you go. And I'm not happy with that. So what we should have done, what I missed is curve strength over here. So over here it says like how much you're going to follow the curves. Let's dial that up to 100. And this is where I'll go get a cup of coffee. There's a few instances in the 3D world where you just go get a cup of coffee or you go to lunch. Remeshing, rendering, baking out maps, things like that. And oh, that's not too bad. So you can see it's not perfect, but the loops are generally following the orbits of the eyes and the mouth the way we wanted them to. It's not perfect. To make a proper animatable mesh, we would have to go in and edit this, and I'll show you that at a later date. But for now, this is good enough. This is good enough for government work. We have lost, you'll notice we've lost a lot of detail here, but not to worry, because I've made a copy. I forgot to mention that, but I did make a copy of the original mesh with the details that we want to preserve, and we can now reproject this detail onto our new mesh. All right, well, that is all we do have time for this week. So I will finish this up next session, and then we'll get back into sculpting our character Shun. All right, catch you later.